Those of you who haven't met me, I'm Andrew Bamford. I'm here to introduce our speaker for today. Professor David Edwards from Department of Plant Sciences will be known to, I'm pretty sure, everyone in the room, so I'll be very brief. But just to outline a little bit of David's biography, he's been in lots of good places before we managed to get him here. So he's been in UEA, in Leeds, in Princeton, for a while at James Cook, in Australia. He then went to Sheffield, spent a decade there teaching, and then came to Cambridge a year ago. Started here in 2023. He's a tropical forest ecologist, as we all know, and conservation scientist, and he works across the piece on lots of different questions that obviously are reflected in the broad interest in what he's going to say today, but broadly around the questions of the impacts of land use and also trade on biodiversity in tropical forests. I'm sure many of you were at the fantastic talk David gave as his inaugural lecture a couple of weeks ago down at the Sainsbury lab, and that was tremendous. And the really good news is that David's promised me that today's lecture will be completely different. So over to you, David.
Thanks very much, Andrew, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm not seeing too many happy faces today. Or I hope to cheer up slightly. For those who I've not met, I'm really excited to be here and over the course of the coming years to get to know people. So forests, they have immense values for both biodiversity and society. They contain about 80% of all the world's species on about a third of the world's land. And of course, they've got a whole suite of amazing things. These are 3 taxonomic groups we work on a lot. We work on trees, we work on birds, we work on orchids. I did talk a lot about orchids in that last lecture, so I removed orchid stuff, but very happy to talk about orchids with anyone who's interested. But we don't just have biodiversity, as I say, there are also enormous other values. The carbon stocks contained within tropical forests like the Gola forest, or within forests that we restore, they are worth tens of billions of dollars annually. $1.5 trillion a year is the amount of money that we earn from our harvest of timbers at global scale. And that starts to intersect back with biodiversity in the context of tropical logging. Here, 400 million hectares being logged, take out specific tree species. Those species often move into substantial decline. You see degradation of the remaining forests and erosion of carbon stocks. People use wood. In Africa, 90% of people use wood for fuel. And there are over 6 million kilometres squared of indigenous lands in the tropics alone, where people are getting all sorts of other things that they require for their livelihoods. So forests, they have these enormous conservation and societal values, but those are at substantial risk. And of course, the key driver of that risk is simply the wholesale conversion of those forests. We lost enormous amounts of forest in the northern hemisphere over the last century or so. In the last 3 decades, that focus has very much gone towards the tropics. We've lost 20% now in the last 3 decades. As climate change intensifies, we're also seeing kind of unstoppable degradation of forests. We have massive droughts occurring in forests. Stressed trees, if they don't die, are then often attacked by things like bark beetles. Millions of hectares of forest have gone, and we're seeing enormous wildfires globally. So the big question that we're focusing on in the group is this: how to deliver the security of forest biodiversity and ecosystem services. And I'm going to think about a couple of angles of that work today. Firstly, how does this deforestation event impact tropical biodiversity, and bringing to bear how it impacts across spatial scales. And then thinking more broadly about security of forest-based services under global change. Okay, so these impacts of deforestation across scales. This is some of my former work. Most studies are like this. I did some work, worked hard. I went to northeast Borneo. I went to some landscapes. I sampled the impacts of converting different kinds of forests, logged and unlogged, to oil palm. And we can see there's a roughly 50% drop in the species richness of dung beetles. Okay, that's one study. Lots of people are doing these kinds of studies, and what you can then do is aggregate them to come up with a global understanding as to how much biodiversity is lost when you convert to forest. So that's what Luke Gibson did here. He's done a meta-analysis of all the different studies he can pull together and finds that there is indeed a decrease in diversity, and of course there's some variation between different drivers of that loss. This is a global scale extrapolation cited nearly 2,500 times. This is how we think about quantifying our biodiversity loss. But there's a problem. And the problem is that we're overlooking with these kinds of studies the turnover of species that happens across space. So in other words, beta diversity. We may expect higher beta diversity, a higher rate of turnover of species with space in forest than we would in farming, and that would generate biotic homogenization. But you may fail to detect that if you don't sample at a big enough scale. So are we underestimating biodiversity loss through our preponderance of small-scale study? So we wanted to tackle that question, and we've done that, focusing on farming in the form of cow farming, which is by far the most prevalent driver of deforestation. We're working in Latin America. We've picked the world's most biodiverse country, pretty much, Colombia, to work in. And we've worked on birds. We've also done the same work on dung beetles, but we'll talk about birds and orchids, but we'll talk about birds. Big thanks go to Simon Mills and Jacob Sokolite. They did a lot of field work, but they also did a massive amount of computational heavy lifting to enable us to draw out these patterns. So this is what we've done. We've sampled in Colombia, but we've sampled across 13 ecoregions. We've got 850 sample points. And when we've done all that sampling, spanning many years of field work, this is what we find. We've got 25,000 detections of 971 bird species. I think this is the single largest avian data set ever produced globally. So we're really excited about the data set. What we then do is we do some modeling. We're modeling species-specific responses to forest conversion. We do that for all 971 species because we're using a hierarchical biogeographic multi-species occupancy model, which incorporates lots of information about species-specific ranges, about their traits, their biology, their functions. We're able to also project to 600 species that we never even detected. These are the species that in my small-scale work and that of others, we simply overlook. We don't have enough effect. We can't even model these rare things. Okay, so we apply that and we end up with something that looks a bit like this. For every single species, we have two maps. We have the occupancy probability for that species in forest on the left, and if you lost all the forest and it was a pasture on the right. So the top bird, the Savannah hawk in forest, extremely low occupancy probability. In farmland, now we have a much higher occupancy probability. That is a species that benefits from conversion. Down the bottom, Pompadour Cotinga, we've got the flip. We have quite some high occupancy, particularly as we move east in the Amazon there. We have basically no occupancy in a pasture. And bicolored antpitter, again, lots of occupancy in the central Cordillera, not in pasture. Now these all move over to this distribution on the right here. This is 1,614 species of distribution. And the red line is zero, no effect of farming. If you sit above the red line, you're a species that benefits. If you sit beneath, you're a species that doesn't. poorly. And about 85% of species do poorly. So we're looking at the pan-Columbian distribution of species sensitivity to land use change. So what happens if we contrast this near pan-Columbian distribution with the effects that we would have found if we just worked in one ecoregion or a different ecoregion or another one instead? So that's what we find here. We've got the relative difference in terms of the amount of loss you would have seen in Colombia versus any one of these 13 ecoregions. So if we look at Santa Marta at the top, that has the least sensitive community. It's almost 3 times less sensitive than the pan-Columbian community. And that's the case also kind of 2.5 times the Magdalena dry forests. These are relatively low diversity systems. The Caqueta, the Napo here, they're more like 20, 30, 40% decline. Okay, now what we can then do is say, well, if we happen to be that researcher who goes out to one study site, how much loss on average are we missing relative to pan-Columbian level? And then if we were to sample 2 ecoregions, how much would we do? That's what we can see here. So as we add the number of regions, ecoregions we sample, we can see how the relative difference, the underestimation, starts to decline. If you just sample 1, then on average, you're underestimating loss by 60%. If you sample 2, that's 28%. And in fact, you need to get to 6 to 7 to be within the 95% confidence intervals of pan-Columbian effect. Okay, so we're seeing substantial scale-dependent loss. So we do find, yes, biodiversity loss is occurring when you convert, but we see that when you work at the 1 or 2 ecoregion scale, you are really massively underestimating the degree of loss that's actually occurring. And in fact, you need to sample around this 6 to 7 ecoregion scale to capture that national level loss from this one driver of change. So then we can ask, well, what drives the underestimation of loss? What is it about the environment that might drive this severe underestimation? We modelled a whole bunch of things, but the 2 things that leapt out are these: geographic distance and elevation. So what we've got here is our it's pairwise comparisons of all the different sites. It's thousands of cells, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And partial ecological distance is basically the difference in your community. So if you look at pasture in red, you start out here, a few kilometres apart. Yes, you see a turnover of species. But as you move to larger and larger distances, we find that the communities really don't differ from each other anymore. This is biotic homogenization, you could say. But that's particularly illustrated because as we build distance in a native habitat, we still continue to see a turnover of species. So that is a massive driver, particularly as we move to further ranges. Then we look at elevation here. We've sampled this enormous elevational range of nearly 4,000 meters. And we do find, even in pasture, there is a turnover of species, as we might expect with altitude. It's not a particularly steep turnover. By contrast, we have a much steeper relationship in forests, particularly up to about 1,500 meters, and then again from like 2,500 up to 4,000. So what all this means is if you try to extrapolate from local scale studies through our classic meta-analytical kinds of approaches, we are systemically underestimating the degree of biodiversity loss that's happening. So that is, at least at the scale of Colombia, probably more broadly, I would say, failure to sample sufficiently across those geographic scales which land uses are happening and across that core gradient that we know is a big dictator of biodiversity, which is elevation. So where are we going next? On the left here, Diego Martinez, my PhD student, he's playing with those dung beetle data. He's working on those to ask the similar questions. And on the right, Giovanni Perez, he's taking those bird data and he's now thinking about them through other lenses, functional and phylogenetic diversity. But what we now realise is, of course, we really have to include spatial structure into our measures of environmental change. And of course, we can conclude that it is absolutely critical that we really secure our forests for conservation of biodiversity. Okay, so let's move on then to think about beyond biodiversity. Let's think about the security of these other services that we have in provided by forests. And we'll think about three things. Think about wildfire. We're going to think about secondary forest, particularly the persistence of those forests. It's all very well having a secondary forest, but you need it to remain over time. What about the persistence of those forests? And then we can think about the role of indigenous and local peoples in helping to conserve forest resources. Okay, so thinking about wildfire, the key question is whether this massive wildfire events that we're seeing is threatening global timber production. And this is Chris Bousfield, my then PhD student, who did for his PhD. What he did was bring together these two global layers, the best global products where we produce timber. And he crossed that with this other amazing product, which has painfully identified what drove deforestation. In particular, splitting it between other, let's say farming, and wildfire. So when Chris crosses these layers, he can then work out how much timberland we've lost through wildfire. And while he identifies a really substantial losses. We'll look here using the lesive layer, which does better in the tropics. It actually maps logging in the tropics, Curtis doesn't. We're seeing northwest US, Russia, northern Russia. We're seeing Australia there and Brazil really leaping out. And if you can combine all of that loss, you find that that's 25 million hectares of timber production that's gone up in Curtis. As I say, they didn't really model Brazil, so they've got slightly less there, but they're seeing hotspots everywhere else that we've identified them. Portugal as well, of course, 19 million hectares of lost timber. Okay, so that's a really substantial loss. We can then think about how that loss is happening over time. And that's what we've done here. We've got the year in this 20-year time frame on the x-axis, annual forestry area lost on the y. And for the first 15 years of the century, it was kind of flat. We weren't really seeing a change. But then from 2016, we've seen this massive leap in losses of timber-producing forests. That's a doubling to quadrupling of the amount of loss. And I would bet that if we could have modelled the Canadian megafires from last year, the Brazilian megafires from this year, and those other big fires we've seen, that these relationships will carry on getting even steeper. So we've already lost an area the size of Great Britain. That's worth about $60 billion in timber value. There's an increasing burn trend. So what we've done there is look in the rearview mirror. We said, what have we lost? But the key thing that we now need to do, and that Dom here is going to do, is to think about how much timber will we lose under climate change. As we get those ever more intense weather events, fire weather, how much more timber do we think we're actually going to lose? And in turn, how can we manage forestry to try and reduce that risk? Because if we don't start managing our forests, it seems likely, one would hypothesize, we're going to lose a lot of our future timber resource. Okay, so now we can think about secondary forest persistence. And we're in the UN decade on ecosystem restoration. We've got the Bonn challenge to bring 350 million hectares of land under restoration by 2030. These are massive global policy agendas. And really what we're talking about often, though, is something quite simple. It's taking away some stressor, usually cows, in Latin America at least, and then leaving it. Maybe you plant a few trees as well along the way, or a few trees, and over time you get a forest structure starting to recover. So What we want to know then, or we do find, sorry, that there is substantial amount of recovery of both carbon and biodiversity as we let these forests mature, as they become older. It's just some work that we did from Colombia some years ago. We'll focus on the left. We've got pasture, our secondary forest age and primary, and we've got our carbon stocks. And put simply, we find that we're getting a massive, it's a logarithmic scale, massive increase in carbon stocks, reaching about half the amount of carbon that you find in a primary forest after about 30 years. On the right here, we're looking at occupancy probabilities of birds in primary forest against these older secondary forests. So we're now seeing occupancy probabilities that are really closely aligned. So we're recovering most of the species that we would like to recover in these older secondary forests. So having older forests is really important, but then the question is, does the persistence of older secondary forests at global scale vary with space and with time? So what we do is we develop, this is Chris Boulsfield again, this is for his postdoc, he's been developing a 30-year restoration time series across the tropics. And this is what it looks like. There are 51 million hectares in 2023 of secondary forests at this pan-tropical scale. There's differences, though, in the ages of those, and it's easier to see when we break them down by age class. So that's what Chris has done, 3 core regions of the tropics. We've got our age classes in 5-year brackets and our total area of land on the Y there. And there are a couple of key take-home points. Firstly, in all 3 regions, there is by far the dominant forest, secondary forest, is in this 0 to 5-year class. That represents just over 50% of all of the world's tropical restoring forests are less than 5 years old. In other words, they won't have as much carbon and they haven't had time to bring back that biodiversity. When you need to come towards me, these older forests here, 20, 30 plus years old, they represent 6% of our current secondary forest estate, 3 million hectares. So where are the hotspots then of this older restoration? Where are we seeing older forests persist? Where are we seeing forests persist such that they become older? So we're looking here at the kind of ratio of older secondary relative to all secondary. And we see countries in blue. Those are the ones that have an overrepresentation, given the amount of secondary forests they have, of older habitats. So we're seeing most neotropical countries leap out there, particularly the massive Brazil, Colombia, Peru. We're seeing a few other places elsewhere. On the flip side of that, we're seeing areas, particularly West Africa, some of the other areas in Africa, parts of Asia, really underrepresented. These places, yes, they get secondary forests, but as soon as they've got them, they're losing them, starting that successional clock again. So huge areas of forests are recovering, particularly young forests. And those older forests, they're much rarer and they dominate in South America. So how does restoration, if we were to recreate lots of forests, and another big question is how might that impact the existence of forests that was already around the areas you've restored, or other forests that occur further away from where you're conducting your restoration? This is Simran Miao. Simran. She's my PhD student, and she's been tackling this question at pan-sub-Saharan African scale. This is the first big data set Simran's put together from East Africa. What we can see here in the red points is a bunch of locations which have received restoration. And then Simran has done a statistical matching, which allows her to control these kind of confounding socio-environmental factors that might dictate whether or not you find some enhanced or reduced deforestation off-site, and create control points. And the control points are all these blue dots. So then Simran's able to detect basically the difference between the deforestation in the blue dots relative to the red dots. So that's what we see here. And we see this is within the project. So projects happen, but as I say, there can still be other bits of forest occurring. And we see that There's a marginal perhaps increase if you were to create plantations, but if it's agroforestry or watershed management, we're seeing quite substantial reduction in deforestation within project area. As we move outside the project area, we see the first couple of kilometres, no real effect, a negative effect around the 2 to 5 kilometre line, and then some negatives to plantation and watershed, maybe a hint of some positive there. This is not significant in the context of the 5K plus fund. I think the key conclusion from all that, though, is that when we're doing restoration, we're at the very least, it seems, not got good evidence that there's any enhancing of deforestation rates at these local scales. And I should comment that what we're dealing with here are people who aren't really in the formal economy, not growing bananas and shipping them down to some seaport and sending them off to the UK. So these folks are working and trading at local scale. Okay, so restoration doesn't appear to drive deforestation. It might possibly reduce deforestation rates sometimes. And so there's no increased evidence of increased loss. So then we need to understand, well, what's the effectiveness of restoration types for different ecosystem services? So if we do one thing or the other, how is that going to affect a range of ecosystem services? And then in turn, what are the longer term risks under global change? And I've got a NERC grant starting next year that's going to allow us to start unpicking some of these questions. Okay, so I'm going to finish with this third question of, is there a role of indigenous and local people? Now, there are 2.4 million kilometres squared of protected areas in tropical moist forest. It's a massive area. But there are 4 million kilometres squared of indigenous lands, and there are another 2.1 million kilometres squared of indigenous lands that overlap with formal protected area status. So we've got PAs, ILs, and PIAs. This is Jocelyn C., my previous PhD student, and for her first chapter, she wanted to ask whether indigenous lands reduced deforestation at pan-tropical scale. And then she wanted to think, well, okay, that's a pan-tropical analysis. What happens if we start looking at individual nations? How does that vary in response? And she's again done statistical matching, and she's contrasting non-protected sites, no protection, no indigenous peoples, with ILs, PAs, and PIAs. So this is what she finds. I'll talk you through Africa. So we have our proportion deforested in a 10-year window. And we've got 3 colours. The green line is our control. That's the amount of deforestation you have without any of these other things. We're interested in the orange, particularly interested in the orange, which is where we have indigenous communities, and there is a reduction, although by no means down to 0 in deforestation. And we're also particularly interested in protected indigenous areas. And there's a marginal increase, if anything, at Africa scale when you have protected indigenous areas. A prettier picture in the Americas and Asia Pacific, indigenous lands or protecting indigenous lands are promoting a reduced deforestation relative to our unprotected control. Now, what happens if we dig into that and start thinking about individual nations? So I blanked out, for the purposes of this, anything where the matching hadn't really worked as well as we would like. So now we're looking at things with which we have real confidence in our statistical approach. We've got 28 countries here, and they fall into 3 categories. The first, there are 7 of them, are places in which indigenous lands and protected indigenous areas performed no better than not having anything, or often they performed worse. Bolivia, just as an example. The next category are these 4 countries. In these countries, indigenous lands performed very well. They reduced deforestation, and often they did so relative better than protected indigenous areas. The majority of countries, what's that? That's 17 countries, fall into this final category. All of these countries, it's protected indigenous areas that provided the very best outcomes in the context of reducing deforestation. And in many cases, Suriname, Vietnam, Uganda, Kenya Indigenous lands that didn't have any formal protection attached to them were performing really quite poorly. Okay, so indigenous lands, they do at global pantropical scale, they do reduce deforestation, but when we dig in, we find there are actually many nations that buck that, and it's protected indigenous areas that provide the best options for avoiding deforestation. That's great, but we worked on a 10-year time frame, and indigenous communities, of course, have been on their lands for millennia. So, and so there is far longer term human influence within these forests. So what Jocelyn did for her second PhD chapter was ask whether indigenous lands and protected indigenous areas also protect forest integrity. And so she's used the Forest Landscape Integrity Index to get a handle on that. So we've got a similar looking figure to the last one, but the key point here, we've got the FLII on the y-axis, is that what we want to be is higher up the y-axis. We don't want to be low. We want to be high. We want to go above this green bar because we want higher integrity forests. If you look at indigenous lands first in Africa, they're slightly better off, but actually not significantly so. In the Americas, they're no better off. And in the Asia Pacific, they're significantly worse off in the context of this integrity. It is the protected indigenous areas across all three tropical regions in which we're seeing a strong positive effect of the presence of indigenous peoples supported by legal frameworks of formal protection. So PIAs have the highest protective effect on integrity. Indigenous lands have lower long-term integrity. So the final thing that Jocelyn did was then ask, well, what about the biodiversity values of these indigenous lands and these protected indigenous lands? And we could flip that to IPLs now because we're lumping them all together. Do they have important biodiversity? What she did is overlay 11,600 forest-dependent vertebrate species, AOH ranges, with the ranges with the IPL boundaries. And this is what she finds. It's quite a complex figure. So what we've got is amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles, 4 taxonomic groups, the number of species on the Y that fall into a threatened, not threatened, or data deficient classes. So the first key take home is that 8,874 species, that's 3/4 of all of the species, have some part of their range intersecting with an indigenous or indigenous protected land. And that includes a lot of important species. That's 1,250 species that are threatened to have some of their range in these lands. The next two kind of key findings are related to these shades of colour. And the darker the blue, the higher the percentage of the global range of a species is within IPLs. So if we look at the 3 darkest shades of blue, that's 60% of your global range in IPLs or more. 20%, all of these species have got over 60% of their ranges in indigenous protected lands. There are 288 species that have all of their global range in lands that are with indigenous people. So enormous value. So IPLs, they have this massive biological value. Even 300 odd species have got their whole global range in these lands. Now, a key question going forward that I think we really need to tackle is then whether there is a risk of overexploitation of fauna, in particular of large-bodied fauna by indigenous communities. And there I think we have to bring, again, contrasting abundances between ILs and PIAs versus control areas. Nonetheless, there clearly is a very important role of indigenous and local communities in conservation. And I think we need to do a couple of things. We need to improve land security. And we may well be doing that through formal collaboration with protected areas. Something we've argued in a paper published last week, we also need to think about enhancing collaboration with carbon finance schemes. They've got a lot of money and they can help indigenous communities perhaps protect their borders. They can help indigenous communities ensure they are harvesting sustainably from their forests. Okay, so I hope by now I've persuaded you there are substantial risks and challenges to forest ecosystem services and conservation more broadly. I think we urgently need to identify and adopt resilient and sustainable management. And it's with that that I'm starting a Centre for Global Wood Security. We're going to be focusing on all of these values, the timber, the fuel woods, the carbon, and the biodiversity conservation under global change. We're going to be uniting key academic, NGO, industry and policy partners. I'd be delighted to speak to anyone who has an interest in joining that initiative. Together, we want to tackle these grand challenges to help us avert major biodiversity losses of forest diversity and these ecosystem services. So with that, a few concluding points. The measures of biodiversity loss that we use, the field-based measures, they are heavily scale dependent. There is a risk of using local scale evidence from biodiversity, from global deforestation, etc., to draw regional to global scale conclusions. Global change and the feedbacks that are inherent in global change, they are putting a massive strain on our forest ecosystems. And I'll finish by saying I really think we do need a sustained research and policy focus and collaboration to future-proof our forest conservation and our management. With that, I want to thank all of my PhD students and postdocs and master's students, they're not on here, apologies to them, from previous and present. They are the big drivers of so much of the work that we've managed to achieve, and just an enormous thanks to them. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, David. That was a whirlwind. Lots of things to think about. Questions?
Sorry, a bit controversial here. Noelle Campbell from BirdLife. That was brilliant, thank you. Do you think you've answered the question of whether Indigenous peoples conserve 80% of biodiversity? Because 76% was quite similar from a very different, very dodgy source. Do you know about this issue, this question, this controversy? No. Well, you may have unwittingly answered it.
Controversy with respect to.
So there's been a bit of fake news kind of repeated over like years and years now, but comes from a very, it's hard to find the original source. We looked into it a while back, but it's from like a dodgy World Bank.
The 80% number.
The 80% of Indigenous peoples conserving 80% of biodiversity. And there wasn't any very good evidence for it. Recent opinion piece kind of against it, but you have actually said that 76% of species are in Indigenous land.
So my initial 80% number is about all of the world's species. The 76% is about the world's tropic species, and we're really happy that 76% of the world's forest-dependent species, there are 11,700 of those. We're very happy with your range maps. Thank you very much. Which we were cropped to create AOHs before you guys had done the same, Lumbiers. And we did the same for the IUCN. If you're here, thank you very much. And we cropped those ranges, so we had AOHs. And then we've got that 76% number. So ours goes to the Global Change Biology paper. That's a very rigorous methodology. You can see how we've come up with that number.
Yeah, so it's just tropics. So yeah.
Just tropics, and I can't comment on this 80%.
No, I'm just saying it's quite similar. So anyway, but so therefore be careful it doesn't get overquoted in the wrong context. Then
I see a hand over there somewhere. Well, go ahead.
One of your forestry maps seemed to show a area of central and western Amazonia that wasn't for forests, or wasn't for timber. Is that because it's not slated for timber production?
No, that is because the Curtis layer doesn't include tropical selective logging, which might, in fairness, is very hard to know where is slated for logging, where isn't, where has been logged, where hasn't. So that's why you see that big hole there. Curtis just said, we're not going there, it's too difficult. So they've modelled kind of, I'll call them lower diversity timber systems up in the northern hemisphere, which are maybe natural systems, but you know, they can be more clear cut. And then they've modelled plantations, which are tropical as well. So Brazil around the Amazon has lots of dots. That's because it's got loads of eucalyptus plantations. And
sorry. So given my overinterpretation there, do you think you'd find similar trends in non-tropical systems for about any of this work, really? I mean, is it quite specific to the tropics, and are you only looking at the tropics? Could you not, are you looking at this in temperate and boreal forests?
For timber fire and some of those other stresses I've not talked about, we've been looking kind of at a global scale. For secondary forests, we've been focusing on the tropics, and there's good reason for that, which is frankly, that's where we're seeing most of the world's restoration. We're not really seeing, if you look at global commitments to restoration, they're all in the global south. Pretty much a few tens of millions of hectares is what the north can possibly offer up, which is pretty pathetic. The last thing, the indigenous lands, I couldn't possibly comment. We used a global layer and tropical layer of where all the indigenous lands are, and I don't think I'm aware of a similar product which maps outside of the tropics. If there is one, I'd be happy to work on it, but we use the garnet layer. But without the map, we can't model where they are. Oh, sorry.
Okay, I've got a question coming from online from Vivek, who asks, how much role could agroforestry play in addressing global wood security, thereby sparing protected areas?
Okay, Andrew.
Sorry, I will speak a bit louder. Sorry, this is from Vivek online. How much role could agroforestry play in addressing the global wood security issue, thereby sparing protected area forests from exploitation?
Thank you for that. I think most agroforestry that I'm aware of in Africa is going to be working at two levels that are not going to intersect particularly well with timber. Most of it is adding trees for food security. So I think trees that grow, for example, nuts in the dry season. That's enormously important, and I suppose that might create less pressure on forests for food when food is scarce. And the other key thing is fuel wood, which is not part of the timber analysis we've done. But again, that might stop, it may well stop people kind of going to do kind of local scale degradation. I don't think it's going to stop the big driver in sub-Saharan Africa of fuel wood, of growing work, charcoal. They're going for hardwood miombo trees, which have been growing for hundreds of years to create charcoal synthesis. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Any other questions? I've got a quick one, David, which is your last point about indigenous lands and carbon finance. I wonder if you had any views on the difficulty that indigenous communities do face in trying to enter carbon finance arrangements because of the high entry costs for certification and the fact that 70–80% of all the money that is paid on a carbon credit or other carbon finance never gets to the community. If you had any views on that.
I'll make a few comments, caveated straight up front that I'm not the world's expert in how carbon funding flows, but fundamentally, the reason we think that these carbon bodies should be engaging more with indigenous communities is that they need to protect their own resource, right? Without the carbon funding being there to ensure there's no degradation, to maintain large body vertebrates that are so critical to maintain long-term forest function, then you can see an erosion of their business fundamentally. There are clear barriers, and I recall some good work which was talking about trying to create collectives, for example. I don't know if those work so well or not, but we simply have to do it if we want to prevent that loss of integrity, I think, of these tropical forests that are so valuable for carbon biodiversity. I hope that answers the question, albeit in a caveated way.
Thank you. questions. Noel, you have another question?
Last question number 3.
You could chat afterwards, yeah, on that and the previous question. Yeah, I mean, there's a case there, you're making a strong case for, and there's a whole load of discussion about biodiversity markets and biodiversity finance and packaging that with carbon. So there's a clear case for biodiversity increasing the resilience and integrity and the value of the carbon market. So not just a sort of co-benefit, but actually increasing its value. So that's really helpful. My other follow-up, which was the early one about the global thing, and like the EU, and a problem in policy negotiations is the focus on the tropics and the developing world, and what is Europe doing, for example. And there's a very clear need, and we have, you know, laws and things about restoring in Europe, for example, in the EU. So I do think it's important to have the science backing a similar equivalent science and focus on globally. So it isn't a sort of finger pointing or a, you know, you need to do this and we're not going to do it here, or we're going to do it differently. Do you see what I mean?
I couldn't agree with you more. The only paper I've ever published specific to the United Kingdom was about the profitability of sheep farming and how much it would cost us to turn sheep fields into restored forests. And the answer is it wouldn't be that expensive, and we can restore our uplands. We can take away these sheep and we can recreate forests right here. And I agree, there is totally a neo-colonialistic bent to what's going on. So who's going to take on the sheep farms? I was at Sheffield at the time. It wasn't a particularly loved study in that region, I can assure you. But we don't have the political appetite, frankly, to take on. The only reason sheep farmers are in business, I'm going on a rant now, but they receive subsidies. Otherwise, they're totally broke. We, even if we're vegan and vegetarian, are busily paying to keep the sheep on the fields and the peaks and stopping the restoration that we should be doing right here, as well as undoubtedly there's opportunities in the tropics too.
But it's also about the wood supply and liberating energy in the big bioenergy market, and boreal forests in North America and Australia. You know, there are big problems with those forests being impacted for use and timber supply, etc. So there are equivalent issues that we need to be addressing, and this work use similar arguments, hopefully.
Yeah, I find it truly shocking that in the richest countries in the world, Finland, Sweden, Australia, the US, Canada, still ploughing down boreal primary forests. It's totally insane. And of course, disturbing soil, carbon stocks, et cetera, that go with all that. And those trees are going to take, in the north, they're going to take 100 years to regain some structure. They won't regain all of the mosses and God knows what, I'm sure, in that time. But so it's insane, and we're rich. So yeah, these challenges are big. Why do we focus down and keep the focus in on trying to pay the money into the tropics, albeit 70% remains here? Because it's cheaper, and because it's easier not to have to deal with the social issues on our doorsteps.
You think restoration, how much of it is just passive regeneration? Walk away from land and what do we find?
All of it. That's 51 million hectares of land, and there might be some assisted, but those are recreating natural forests, and the vast majority of that is going to be just natural because it's just too difficult to go and plant trees at the 50 million hectare scale. So yeah, we do a lot of activity where we just leave the land and it recovers, but often we find ways to come back and start taking those lands back. And there are perverse laws. A number of countries have got laws about things flipping into protected forests as the secondary forests mature. So I think Costa Rica's 15 years. So you'll find this lost forest at around 13, 14 years because they don't want their land designated as a permanent forest. Perverse laws that we need to look at as well to help that change to a more persistent secondary forest.